Thank you for joining us. I'm Bob Grove, President of the Climate Council and Executive Producer of the Climate Hour. We're here to have a conversation about climate issues. And I know that's a broad topic. Climate issues aren't just the weather disasters we see every day. Climate issues are about politics, climate legislation, voting rights. Climate issues are about environmental justice and climate equity. There's the health issues associated with environmental pollutants and emerging novel viruses like COVID, and climate issues like habitat loss, desertification, ocean rise, food crop and water supply failure. There's a lot we can talk about, but this conversation is less about topics and more about the people who are part of the movement. With us is Brigadier General Wendell Chris King, US presidential candidate and Green Party co-founder Howie Hawkins, Vote Climate US PAC's president Karyn Strickler, Citizens Climate Lobby leader Stephen Melton, and author and former DNC member Winston Apple. This is going to be very unstructured. It's a conversation. I'd like to start with each of us identifying our core climate issues, but after that, let's just see where the conversation goes. Those of you in the audience have a Q&A button to send us questions. Start your question with someone's name if it's for a specific person, or you can just address your question to the room. So what are your core climate issues? Steve, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and thanks to your audience for having me on tonight's program. Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonprofit, nonpartisan grassroots volunteer organization focused on national and international policies to stop climate change. CCL is our acronym, has about 200,000 members nationally and is growing internationally as well. Our lobbying focuses on enacting laws establishing cash fees, taxes essentially, on fossil fuels based on their greenhouse gas emissions. Rising fees on fossil fuels is the best and cheapest way to discourage their use and incentivize people, that's families, businesses, and organizations, to switch away from fossil fuels to sustainable energy alternatives. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientists who advise the United Nations on the climate crisis, state that carbon pricing is necessary to meet our goals of 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. The world's economists agree that raising carbon fees are essential to success in stopping emissions causing global warming. CCL agrees with that assessment wholeheartedly. We have helped create a bill called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, House Resolution 2307, which has 92 co-sponsors in the current Congress in Washington, including Representative Emanuel Cleaver of Missouri's 5th District. The bill would place a steadily rising excise tax on fossil fuels at their source, the coal mine or the oil field or the gas field, and return 100% of the revenue to American households. Imagine getting the oil and coal companies to pay you money every month. Enacting this law would create clean US industries and jobs, achieve a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050, and put money in the pocketbooks of American families along the way. The Citizens Climate Lobby Kansas City chapter, which I am privileged to lead, lobbies our congressional delegation regarding carbon pricing legislation. We work to keep stakeholders like local governments, the Chamber of Commerce, the Mid-American Regional Council, and businesses and organizations informed regarding carbon pricing legislation. And we also work towards adoption of fair, effective, and sustainable climate change solutions here in the Kansas City region. For instance, the net zero pledge for electricity from Evergy, the MARC Climate Action Plan, and the climate-friendly building codes and development. We can win this battle. The most recent polling of the American electorate shows that 33% of adults are alarmed by the climate change, and another 25% is sufficiently concerned to support governmental action. On the other side, only 19% are doubtful or dismissive climate deniers. A solid majority is demanding something be done, and this majority is growing rapidly. The people are convinced by the horrors they see on the news that action must be taken now. Yet the Biden administration's climate policy faces steep political opposition. We don't yet know what climate change provisions will be passed in the Build Back Better bill as it's recomposed. And the right-leaning Supreme Court will hear a case this spring aimed at curbing the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gases. And of course, the fossil fuel industries are spending huge money trying to elect a Congress in 2022 more friendly to their financial interests. Our task is to ensure that the large majority of US citizens who want to stop climate change can prevail over the special interests who would destroy the habitability of the planet to protect their profits. Perhaps no other year will again be as crucial for climate action as 2022. I urge all our listeners to make their voices heard and heard loudly in the corridors of power. Future generations are depending on you and all of us to stand up and make a difference. If you wish to join your voice with ours at CCL, please check us out at citizensclimatelobby.org. Citizens Climate Lobby, one word, no spaces.org. Or you can go to our local site, kcccl.org. Thank you all for taking time to participate in tonight's forum.
Thanks, Steve. Chris, you want to tell us about your core climate issues?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate tonight, Bob. My participation is as Bob introduced me, I'm a retired military officer, but I'm also an environmental engineer and environmental scientist. I became interested in this topic because my experience was showing that there were significant changes in the environment that in regions of the world for a long time have been producing instability and insecurity, thus become national security interests for the United States and countries around the world. This is not new. In 1986, Norman Myers, who was one of the early scholars in the study of environmental securities and an Oxford scholar, expressed the essence of environmental security in an article he published in the Environmentalist. He stated, and I quote, "National security is not just about fighting forces and weaponry. It relates to watersheds, croplands, forests, genetic resources, climate, and other factors that rarely figure into the minds of military experts and political leaders." My experience agreed with his definition of environmental security. I began my studies of environmental security in 1993 when I reported to teach at West Point and start the first environmental engineering program major at the academy. At the time, my academic inquiry was based on my personal military experience that had shown me across the globe. At that time, water is a scarce resource, was causing instability, human security threats, and even conflict. Just as described by Norman Myers, environmental security is more than just watersheds, though. Now we know that climate change has become a major environmental security threat to security across the world. About the same time that I began my work in environmental security, the United Nations had formed the worldwide scientific group that Steve just mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That group has now issued its 6th assessment report that just came out. The data I will be talking about, and I approach this from a scientific view in my discussions today, is from the IPCC review process, a process that I judge as the most complete peer-reviewed set of science that I've ever seen. Thousands of scientists have participated in that over the last 30 years. And the peer review process is rigorous and strenuous. The 6 reports offers, unfortunately, the most dire warning that we have seen from any of the previous reports. The 6th report offers a catastrophic promise to act or perish. And those are my words in summarizing what I've seen in the sixth report. So I'll leave my introductory comments there, Bob, and thank you for the opportunity to participate tonight.
Thank you for being here. Hey, Winston, tell us about your core values.
All right, I will add to my introduction that I taught high school in the Kansas City, Missouri School District for just over 20 years. Mostly taught government and economics. And I've had a lifelong interest in government and economics. I first was alerted to the climate crisis by, of course, Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth. I was teaching high school at that time, and I can remember leaving the theater thinking, wow, this is serious. I hope somebody does something about this. And then I went right back to teaching high school, although that certainly informed my teaching. But in March of 2014, I read a review in the Kansas City Star of Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction. And that was the first time that I heard anybody raise the possibility of the extinction of the human race as a result of the climate crisis. And after having really no interest in running for office my entire life, despite my interest in politics and government, I filed to run for office the first time 8 days later. And I've run for office 3 times now, and that's all I will run for office. I'm done with that. As Bob mentioned, I served on the Democratic National Committee from 2016 to 2020, and on the state committee here in Missouri from 2016 to 2018. I got into politics because of the climate crisis. And I would say that as we sit here this evening, my concern about that issue has grown steadily from March of 2014 or 1997 to now. I think that we are on an insane trajectory, ignoring an existential threat to the human race. But increasingly, my focus has shifted to politics. And I noticed we had one question so far from Adam, which is very political in nature. And that's exactly where I'm at. If we can't reform our government, Stephen mentioned that we now have a solid majority of people who support government action. We also have a solid majority of people who favor a federal job guarantee. That's at over 70% nationwide and 57% in the lowest of the states, all 50 states. We have around 2/3 who support a public option for healthcare, 90% on gun control, at least background checks. And the common denominator here is that we do not live in a democracy. A democracy is government by the people. It's a government where the will of the people determines public policy. We don't have that. And if we don't get it soon, we are not going to respond appropriately to the climate crisis, because right now corporate interests are in charge of our government, in control of our government. They're in control, effective control of both major parties. The Republican Party is pretty much 100% corporate control. They have had their grip shaken a little bit by Donald Trump. The Democratic Party, I've been pleasantly surprised with Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. They are corporatist, but apparently they've become aware enough about the dangers of the climate crisis that they've started to change, but there's a lot of room for improvement. My understanding is that Biden has issued more permits to drill than any president before him. We're still subsidizing the fossil fuel companies. People like Adam are trying to get their local utility companies to move to clean energy. I live in Independence, Missouri. We have a municipally owned power and light company, and they have installed some solar panels. but I've given up the last few years. I do intend to renew my efforts after the new mayor or re-elected or elect a new mayor and council here in February. But I've begged them to give the owners, the citizens of Independence, the right to purchase solar panels and have the Independence Power and Light buy the energy from its own customers, its own owners. And so far, I've had no luck with that. They did put a poorly structured plan in place that didn't get a great response. So, you know, to me, it all comes down to politics. And my focus right now, I still look over my shoulder and with concern about the climate crisis and many other issues. But unless we can reform our government to make it a genuine democracy, I don't think we're going to make it. I think that my children and grandchildren are going to suffer an increasingly catastrophic future along with everybody else's children and grandchildren. So I will tell you this, I'm going to keep fighting the rest of my life. As long as there's breath in my body, I'll be fighting to make a difference. But my focus right now is on politics. And my focus is on getting 2 bills introduced into Congress. One would give every citizen who is governed by Congress a proxy to give to any member of the House of Representatives. Similar legislation at the state level. And then legislators would get a number of votes equal to however many proxies they hold, plus 1 for themselves. So the more they vote the way people would vote, the more votes they will have. This system be very simple to implement, difficult to administer, but in effect, American citizens would be voting, albeit indirectly, through Congress on legislation. Wouldn't be hard to get around Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema if we had the weight of the American people. I mean, even if in a situation like this, if those 2 and all the Republicans in Congress were seeing their total number of proxies go down daily, they would respond differently. And if the people who are championing this issue, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey in the Senate, who introduced the Green New Deal resolution, if all of a sudden they were getting more and more proxies, at some point, whether it's 2 or 3 members of Congress or 100 or 200, the people who are ready to take action on the climate would have a majority of the votes because they'd have most of the proxies. So and just briefly, the other piece of legislation is to amend Article 5, which is the amendment process, so that it is easier and truly democratic, where if 50% of either the House or the Senate, a majority vote could introduce constitutional amendments, which would be ratified by a majority vote in a nationwide referendum. At that point, we could also extend proxies to the Senate. And if we do this in enough states, we can do it through the states. So those are the 2 ways to get us to where the government will actually be run by the people instead of fossil fuel companies and industrial meat companies and other for-profit organizations.
Thanks, Winston. You mentioned Adam's question about local utilities. Adam, I'd suggest you reach out to renewmissouri.org. I think that's reneumo.org. I'm not sure. If in doubt, go to the climategkc.org website, Climate Council's website, and the partner link, they'll get you to there. But I know that's a bunch of lawyers. They're really up on the state laws in Missouri and Kansas, and can tell you who's taking action and what happens there. So Howie, let's jump to you. Tell us about your core values. What's important to you?
Well, one of the things really important to me is what Winston brought up, and that is this democracy crisis we're in. We have a political system that excludes most of us. Not just voter access to the ballot or protecting the count of the vote, which become real issues, but the fact that we live in a single member district winner take all electoral system where large minorities, sometimes the majority of people, have no hope of electing someone who represents them. Because under this single member district plurality system, one candidate wins and represents their supporters, but everybody else gets no representation. So we got to expand our idea of inclusive democracy to fair ballot access. I can't tell you how hard it is for the Greens just to get on a ballot. People should have the right to vote for who they want. And we need ranked choice voting, so it gets rid of the spoiler effect, so people can vote for who they want without worrying about helping their worst enemy. And then we need proportional representation in our legislatures, so every political viewpoint is represented. And people worried about polarization. When you have a multi-party system, it doesn't pay to go negative on your opponents because you're going to need them in certain coalitions for certain legislation. So I was going to start from the democracy. That kind of provoked, Winston kind of provoked me on those points. But, you know, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists today updated their doomsday clock. And they kept it at 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. And they say we're at, quote, doom's doorstep, unquote. And that's because of the failure of international cooperation to address the climate crisis, the new nuclear arms race with rising Cold War tensions. The COVID pandemic is symptomatic of that problem. And then the democracy part, they say that we have internet-enabled misinformation and disinformation by nations and political actors that have publics confused and not knowing what to believe and not able to formulate clear demands to place upon their governments. And that's part of the democracy crisis. So we've watched the Build Back Better, or as we call it, the Build Back Later bill, shrink and shrink and shrink. And the latest on Build Back Letter was dropped by the New York Times tonight. And Senator Markey called today for passing the climate section of Build Back Better and any other parts he can get Manchin and Sinema to agree to. And then the rest the Democrats will campaign for in 2022 and 2024. So the New York Times called every Republican senator. None were supportive. So the Dems may go for a pared back, Build Back Better climate section through reconciliation. But we have to understand that, you know, what's in there is grossly insufficient. It's all subsidies for clean energy. There are no provisions to systematically reduce carbon emissions, like a renewable energy standard for power utilities. And under that system, we may have what we've had in the last decade, an increase in solar and wind, but no reduction or no major reduction in fossil fuels. We have had some reduction in carbon because the switch from coal to gas has reduced smokestack carbon emissions, although between methane leaks and other sources of carbon in the natural gas fuel cycle, it may be a wash to replace coal with gas. And then you look at the details of the proposals. I don't have time to go into all of them, but basically they're totally inadequate. You know, you look at, they put a big emphasis on electric vehicles, substituting electric engines for internal combustion engines when we need a more resource and energy efficient transportation system based on rails, mass transit for people, freight rails for freight. But even then, it's orders of magnitude too slow. The transportation proposals will take decades rather than years to implement. The proposals for retrofitting building is 2 orders of magnitude, centuries rather than years if you draw out the numbers. So what I think we need to do, climate activists, is stop watching the inside game of progressives in Congress who've been negotiating against themselves, concession after concession, because the balance of forces in Congress don't favor them. They're the minority. Climate activists need to get outside with the people to change the politics so we can get the good things we need to get passed in the near future. And that means organizing and mobilizing, and it's already been mentioned, the majority of people want to do something about climate. So we got to get out and change the politics and raise our demands without compromise or equivocation, build movements in the street, and run candidates for what I would say should be a full Green New Deal. And you can develop that for the local and state as well as federal level. In fact, I believe the states and the cities are going to have to lead and push Congress. The centerpiece of the plan is to get to zero emissions and 100% clean energy on the order of a decade, and then go to negative emissions, because we got to get below what James Hansen hypothesized as the safe level of 350 parts per million. We're at nearly 420 parts per million today. And it takes us back to a time when sea levels were 50 to 70 meters higher, and the temperature was like 7 degrees higher. And that's a climate disaster and maybe an extinction event for us. The Green New Deal has to be global. That means payment to the global South for loss and damage from damages already occurring because of climate change, and also helping them leap out of the 19th century fossil age into the 21st century solar age. It means bringing them up to a decent level of energy. We're gonna have to expand electric energy, solar powered or clean powered. At the same time, we need to bring it down in a country like the United States, which is about 3 times per capita higher than what some policy experts have said is a basic level of energy access, electric access you need for a decent standard of living. And paying that, some people call it climate reparations. I say we should see it as a investment in the habitability of the planet for all of us. And last point is, this needs to be a mobilization by the federal government on the scale of the World War II mobilization, when the federal government took over a quarter of the manufacturing capacity of the country to build what they called the arsenal of democracy to defeat the fascist powers. We're gonna have to do nothing less through the public sector to defeat climate change, because market incentives and corporations making their own decisions is not going to get it done. There needs to be planning and coordination through the public sector, public power, public transportation, public housing, so we can make that transition on a rapid timescale. And it also needs to include provision for everybody's basic needs. We need to meet everybody's basic needs within ecological limits. A job guarantee, a guaranteed income above poverty, affordable housing, quality healthcare, lifelong public education, and a secure retirement. If we don't provide those things as part of a Green New Deal, we're not going to have the political support, because the first thing on people's mind is paying the rent and feeding the family. So I call that an equal socialist Green New Deal, and I think that's what we should be fighting for.
Thanks, Howie. Karyn, you want to talk about your core climate issues?
Yes, thanks, Bob, and welcome to everyone who's here as a participant. I'm the founder and president of Vote Climate US PAC, and our website is www.voteclimatepac.org. I put it in the chat so you can just click and go there. My presentation is about what's at stake and at least one thing that you might do about it. Former NASA climate scientist James Hansen has already been referred to. He said the upper safe limit for CO2 is 350 parts per million. Remember that number, because as Howie just said, that number has increased, and it's increased to almost 420 parts per million. The last time CO2 was this high, humans didn't exist on the planet Earth. And of course, it's that excessive CO2 and other human-made greenhouse gases that are driving the average global temperature, which is driving the weather extremes of all sorts. Remember, the upper safe limit is 350. Today, we're at almost 420. We are in uncharted territory. Average global temperatures have already risen 1 degree Celsius since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the 1.5 degree threshold is the lower target of the landmark Paris Agreement, and it's a critical line that should not be crossed. In order to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, we need to get off fossil fuels. The International Panel on Climate Change says that no later than the end of the century, we need to be down near zero emissions of CO2. I'll tell you where we stand on that. We think it needs to be much more ambitious than that. But in order to achieve zero emissions, we need federal climate legislation. What's at stake? Without action, we may lose more than half of all the species on Earth, and humans may be among them. Since half of the world's populations live near coasts, sea level rise is a serious concern. A 3-foot rise would mean almost completely flooding island nations and many population centers globally. Since the start of the 20th century, sea levels have already risen by 8 inches globally. And James Hansen said that the last time the world was 3 degrees warmer than today, which is what we expect later this century, sea levels were approximately 80 feet higher. That's 80. So that's what we can look for if we don't take action. Scientists have not said that climate change plays a direct role in causing the COVID outbreak, but a catastrophic loss in biodiversity, destruction of wildland, and warming temperatures have allowed disease to explode. And ignoring the connection between climate change and pandemics would be a dangerous delusion, one scientist told us. We know, and we're all beginning to experience, the very dangerous costs of droughts, floods, wildfires, whose intensities and frequencies are increasing as a result of climate change. But there's also an economic cost to inaction. The Stern Review estimated that if we don't act, the overall cost will be equivalent to losing up to 20% of global GDP, whereas the cost of action can be limited to maybe 1% of global GDP annually. There's no economy on a dead planet. The transition to a low carbon economy has the potential to stimulate the economy and create jobs. Our timeline is short. Climate scientist James Hansen says we haven't passed the point of no return. That is, we have not passed the point of no return. We can still roll things back in time, but it's going to require a quick change in direction. So the mission of Vote Climate US PAC is to elect candidates to eliminate human-made greenhouse gas emissions by no later than 2050, and to ultimately bring down greenhouse gas emissions or atmospheric greenhouse gases and to slow climate change. Our call to eliminate all human-made CO2 and methane emissions surpasses that of a net zero emission or a carbon neutral economy. We do not believe that those ideas or those terms go far enough toward the elimination of fossil fuels. Vote Climate US PAC believes that we must keep fossil fuels in the ground for a just, clean energy economy. A recent poll indicated that when you return the revenue to taxpayers in the form of a carbon fee and dividend, which is of course a type of fee on carbon, a whopping 67% of the American public support a fee on carbon. So let's do it. The United States stands alone among the world's advanced economies with no national climate policy. And the world can't achieve climate solutions with the United States of America standing on the sidelines. So what did we do about it? Vote Climate US PAC works to elect climate action candidates with our national climate change voters guides so that we can pass the critical climate legislation that we need. You can find our voters guides at www.voteclimatepac.org. We provide a user-friendly map so you can find your senators, your representative, and their climate calculations, which is an overall score that we give to every candidate. This is an incredible tool for Americans to use to vote climate. If you go to our page, you can click on your state, you can enter your zip code, you can enter your candidate's name, or at the bottom of the page, there's a place to look up your representative if you don't know who it is. But when you get there and you click on your state and you click on one of your representatives to see their overall climate calculation, also click the green plus button beside the name, and you will find what some people have referred to as a buttload of information and the research that we did on these people in a variety of categories, which I'll go into in a minute. We researched more than 1,000 candidates nationwide. We give climate calculations also to the US presidency. You can find that also on our voters guide from 2020. We'll be doing that every 4 years. And every incumbent and challenger for a seat in the US House and US Senate is rated in our voters guide, helping America to vote climate. Our voters guide goes well beyond a normal score to include not only votes, which most voters guides use, but we also score position, we score leadership, and we score putting a fee on carbon. We turned our 2020 voters guide into our 117th Climate Scorecard, which you can also find in the drop-down menu under voters guides on our webpage. We feature the election winners who are now incumbents in the US House and the US Senate. And the scorecard is a national resource So between elections, it helps reporters, leaders, activists, organizers, and regular citizens hold their lawmakers accountable on climate change with detailed information. And again, to see the research behind each climate calculation, click the green plus button next to their name. We also very recently developed a gubernatorial voters guide for all 50 states. In 2021, we released New Jersey and Virginia, since those races happened then, and the remaining races are in 2022, so look for that guide. We also hope soon to be adding some statewide information on state house senators and delegates to that information in the not so distant future. So this should be a massive resource for every American. There's a lot to do. The magnitude of our response has to equal the threat that climate change poses. The most important thing that you can do is to use our voters guide to find climate action candidates in your US House, US Senate, the presidency, and gubernatorial races, and vote climate. Share our voters guide with everyone you know. That's one of the things that we put a ton of work in this Herculean effort of developing this voters guide for everyone to use. We need people to learn about it. We need you to share it. Action on this issue will happen when Americans give climate change the priority it deserves in the voting booth. And if it's used as intended to get every American to vote climate, we believe that our voters guide can revolutionize the politics of climate change.
Thanks, Karyn.
Thank you.
So Winston, I see your hand's up.
Yes, I wanted to ask Howie a few questions. Howie, is there one or more members of Congress that you feel are on board with what you would want them to be? Would they meet the Green Party and your standards as far as saying and doing the right things on this issue?
Yeah,
AOC?
I think some of the progressives, particularly the squad, is trying. I mean, AOC got the Green New Deal from the New York Green Party via her campaign manager who managed a Green campaign the year before. She's never acknowledged that. And what they did, she and Markey, they watered down what we were talking about by a great deal. You know, they eliminated the ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure, the phase out of nuclear power, the cuts in military spending to help pay for the Green New Deal investments, and they extended the deadline 20 years from 2030 to 2050. But that's about as close as we get in Congress. But what I think we need to do is have the movement make demands without compromise. The politicians make compromises. The movement should not be compromising on their behalf. For example, Sunrise Movement, they're the only part of the climate group that got more spending for their climate jobs program, the Civilian Climate Corps. But they went from 15 billion to 45 billion, I think, over 10 years. But on the other hand, it's not like the 1930s New Deal Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a government program, public jobs, the government planned the projects. This is going to be run through AmeriCorps. And it's the old neoliberal thing. You hand out money to private entities. They're going to do requests for proposals. The projects are going to be uncoordinated. It's going to create a whole layer of bureaucracy and not get as much done. And that's where, so, you know, I see our role is helping educate people about these kinds of problems. But I'm willing to work with anybody in Congress that's, you know, serious about getting this kind of program. Markey, I worked with when I was in the Clamshell Alliance. He was pretty good on nuclear power, but he's a creature of Congress where they got to compromise.
Another quick question. How many supporters, not just votes, but people who would vote Green Party, if not for the spoiler effect, how many votes do you think the Green Party would corral if not for the spoiler effect?
Well, judging from where we run in two-way races, I mean, we often win those races or we get, you know, 30, 40%. It's hard to guess, but I would say we're at least a 20% party if people had their preferences. If you look at public opinion polling,
How many million people is that?
well, we had what, about 150, 60 million votes. So 20% of that is about 30 million people.
Imagine if those 30 million people each had a proxy they could give to any member of Congress. And whenever there's a vote on the Green New Deal or any other climate legislation, those 30 million people would be voting indirectly on the legislation. Wouldn't that be a big step in the right direction towards democracy?
You know, I've heard you give that proposal before. I haven't thought it all the way through. It's very different. I'm just, you know, more focused on just enabling candidates access to the ballot and voters the ability to vote for who they really want, because our system precludes that.
This is up on the website now, governmentbythepeople.org. But when you do think it through, and let me tell you, I've been thinking it through for 2 years now, coming up on a 2-year anniversary. And I just keep peeling back layers and going, oh my God. Not only does this circumvent all of the problems with our elections, gerrymandering, voter suppression, long lines to vote, voter ID laws, even just the geographic. You mentioned in a deeply divided two-party nation, if you're a Democrat in Missouri, living in anywhere but Kansas City or St. Louis, any of the other 6 congressional districts, you're represented not at all in Congress. You've got a Republican in the House and 2 Republican senators. If you're a Republican living in Kansas City or St. Louis, you got a couple of senators, but you're not represented in the House. With proxies, everybody who submits a proxy is represented. Everybody gets to vote indirectly because whoever you give that proxy to is voting on your behalf. It would actually make elections irrelevant. There is a plan that's not up on the website. I didn't want to overload people, but it's absolutely possible to constitute a representative assembly just based on who has the most proxies. They're the people who get the seats and they get to cast the votes. And then everyone who's not included, let's say the House is 500 members or 600, anyone that didn't make that cutoff, everyone who assigned them their proxies assigns them to someone who did get the cutoff. But
You know,
every voter would be represented.
I had a similar conversation with former Senator Mike Gravel, who just passed away, who had an idea for direct democracy, you know, basically national initiative referenda.
Now, this isn't direct democracy. I mean, it's pretty close. It's as close as you can get.
Yeah, well,
but representatives could still exercise some discretion at the risk of losing some proxies. But representatives would have a very important role to play, a burden that's been placed on all of us tonight to try to educate the public about these issues and say, this is what we need to do. Give me your proxy and we'll get it done.
yeah,
Karyn, do you
one of
want
my
to jump in here?
concerns is that you would bypass parties and civic organizations, which is where people get educated and organized, instead have kind of a atomized mass relating to the center, which I think is a problem for, you know, informed debate and smart decisions. And if I can briefly answer one of the questions in the chat, Robert Isaacson asked, what about using antitrust law to break up the two-party monopoly in politics? I'm not a lawyer, but I do know that the Greens and Libertarians and others have sued the so-called Commission on Presidential Debates, which sounds like a government agency, but in fact is a private corporation controlled by the Democrats and Republicans, although Trump doesn't know it. He wants to get out of it. But we have been in court using antitrust, you know, arguments against the duopoly and have not been successful. So that's what I can tell you about that.
If I could answer Ramona, I see Stephen's got his hand up, but Ramona's question about what I'm doing to build alliances, the whole idea of the Government by the People website, it's not a group itself. The whole idea is to bring other groups, other political organizations in. Right now, I've contacted 2 members of Congress and getting ready to contact a lot more to get that legislation introduced. And then the idea will be to get groups all over the country, groups that are organized in support of a wide variety of issues, move to amend with corporate, corporations being considered people, and all the other groups, Moms Against Gun Violence. Everyone needs to go on fighting the fight for the issues they care about. But I think everyone also needs to realize, as I think Howie has kind of backed me up on this. If we don't reform the system, none of it's getting passed. And if we reform the system and it we become a genuine democracy, it's all getting passed. Everything the people want is getting passed.
Let's jump over to Karyn. She's had her hand up for a while.
If people vote climate and use it as a top priority issue, we don't need to reform the system. And frankly, I mean, the system needs to be reformed. There's no doubt about that. And I want to talk about democracy in just a second. But if people really make voting climate their top priority and only vote for climate action candidate, we don't need to reform the system right away. And we don't have a very long timeline. That's the rub here. We've got this really short timeline, maybe 10 years in which to do what we need to do. And, you know, do you reform the system before you pass climate legislation? I don't think so. But I also wanted to talk to Stephen for a minute about his bill. His organization, Citizen Climate Lobby and Vote Climate US PAC, my organization, agree that we need a fee on carbon, and a carbon dividend act is a good way to go. His is called the, it's the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of 2021. And I have a lot of issues with it. The biggest one being that the rate of the tax rate or the fee rate is $15 per metric ton in 2021 to increase $10 each year. And it's pretty well accepted that in order for a fee on carbon to be accepted or effective, it's going to need to be $50 to $100 a ton. Why so low, Stephen? Let's get that price per ton way up there so that it does what it needs to do.
You're muted, Steve.
Okay, now let's talk about that. Okay, so you said that in the bill it was $15 a ton in 2021. Well, it's now 2022 and it's $0 a ton. Okay.
Yeah.
When we first introduced this bill in Congress, in the last Congress, it was $15 a ton in 2019, and now it's 2022 and it's zero. Okay, so the fact is we need to get this bill established, and we need to get carbon pricing done starting at any level. $15 is low, but it will rise every year. And it will rise $15 or $10 a ton in per year based on whether or not we're meeting our goals in CO2 emissions reduction. Now, there's nothing that would keep a later Congress from saying we aren't close to meeting our goals, and so we're going to raise it $20. I mean, that's a simple amendment. Or we're going to raise it $25 this year, you know, to get people's attention. But it's like the Chinese say, you know, the longest journey begins with but a single step. We haven't made even the first step into putting a price on carbon.
It's tough to
And so let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let's get a tax on carbon institutionalized in this country, and we can always change the rates as we need to as time progresses. Does that answer your question?
I'm one who believes in asking for what you need or what you want. I understand the political reality. Believe me, I've been in politics for a very long time.
Right.
And, you know, but I don't know. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
And if we did get it, which we haven't, and that becomes a problem.
Well, let me show you the way it's really going to work. Okay. Is when you take to businesses or organizations, governments, things like that, a price on carbon that goes up every year is going to get their immediate attention. Most of our carbon footprint is not based on what we do day in, day out, decisions we make day in and day out. It's based on decisions we made on capital goods a decade ago or 2 decades ago. Where we bought the house, you know, how much insulation is in the house. If you're an industry, what your business process is going to be, and are you going to include fossil fuels in that? When they see those prices many years out, they are going to change their business models. People are going to change the houses they buy, the cars they buy, there is going to be a massive shift in investment, which will drive lower carbon footprints. You know, that's the fact. You know, we can't punish the citizen for the car he bought last year. All we can do is influence the car he buys next year and the year after.
Yeah,
Does that make
I'm
sense?
looking for the corporate polluters to pay and for the citizens to get a rebate. Anyway,
Well,
I have
yes.
a lot of issues with the bill, but I will tell you that we do include it in our voters guide for those who are co-sponsors. We make a mention of that.
Yeah,
for the
we're
person
very
who-
grateful. It's by far the most effective bill for climate change in front of Congress right now.
Yeah, that's true, and that's really sad. I hear you, and I think it's sad.
Yeah.
But
The thing about Biden's approach, and bless his heart, it's all carrot and no stick. It's all incentives. You'll get some incentive if you put in solar panels. You'll get an incentive if you go to wind energy. You'll get an incentive for this. You'll get an incentive for that. But there's no stick for people who don't want to get on board. And the reality is you probably got 30 or 35% of the American people. I mean, just look at the current COVID crisis, who wouldn't do anything for the public good. They could care less on any issue. And how are you going to get them to move away from fossil fuels just by using carrots? They aren't interested in the carrots. It's going to take the stick. It's going to take a combination of a carrot and a stick, to get enough people to do the right thing to make a difference.
Right. I just want to make one quick comment in regards to our democracy in crisis. I'm married to Alan Lichtman, who is also known as the prediction professor. He's the guy who wrote 13 Keys to the White House that predicts every presidential election since 1982 or 80, whatever. The first one in 1980. Was 82 an election year?
80.
84, I guess, was his first prediction. Anyway, but he also wrote a book recently called 13 Cracks, Repairing American Democracy Under Trump. And he gives both the history and the lessons from that history, and also very concrete ideas about what we need to do moving forward to repair our democracy. He also happens to be maybe the preeminent voting rights expert in the United States of America, having testified in more than 100 federal voting rights and civil rights cases. And he wrote another book for people who are interested in the vote and what's going on with it, called The Embattled Vote in America. Again, his name is Alan Lichtman, and these are very well worth reading.
I want to jump over to Robin's question real quick. Robin asked about what we as individuals can do. I mean, we're talking a lot about government here, but individuals, and there are things that we can do to be sustainable. I mean, something like driving an electric car, even if you're powering that electric car from a fossil fuel-based power grid, you're still reducing your greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. So there are things we can do. Eliminate gas from your home, eliminate the gas furnace, eliminate the gas stove, simple things. And I would encourage Robin and other people interested in those individual things to go to the Climate Council's website, Climate GKC, look at their education section, because they offer a bunch of workshops on personal actions you can do to lead a more sustainable lifestyle.
The most important of which is to vote climate. I'm going to put a to our page so people can, every American can vote climate. Single most important thing everyone can do.
That's what my sign says back there. Vote climate for the children. Exactly. That's the message. Vote climate. And this is where I think you and I, we may disagree on some things, but I'm with you. I don't think we have time to reform the US political system from top to bottom and left to right before we can make headways on this. I think we have to drive the climate issue as the wedge, which will get this problem solved. And then hopefully we can begin to solve some of these other problems. But we're dealing with physics here, and the timelines are becoming very short. There's only 8 years till 2030 now, and we have to bring big reductions. And we need to focus on those reductions first, in my opinion, and reform the system as we go. But if we have a big civil war over trying to reform the system, it is not going to end up producing what we need in the time we need it produced. And that's my opinion, and that's where I think I differ with Howie and Winston.
Well, let me respond. You can have a super majority vote for, a climate or a carbon tax and dividend, or be supportive, but we have anti-majoritarian biases in the system. US Senate, a small percentage, I don't have it at the top of my head, can veto what the overwhelming majority wants. You look at the New York Times article today, and you got Republican senators from small states denying there's a climate problem. And they got the power to block everything. You've got the Electoral College, which has the same bias toward these small rural conservative states. And then our single member district plurality system excludes the majority of people from having a representative of their choice, instead of having their fair share in multi-member districts. And that's where we get the gerrymandering, whether it's intentional or it's unintentional, because the nature of single member districts is you're going to get one party districts. So all these things are built into the system, and we can mobilize overwhelming support for change, and it won't translate into public policy. So I don't think we should counterpose our climate demands from our democracy demands. The other point, while I got the floor, I'd like to address is how much we can do by individual consumer choices. International Energy Agency had a recent study, looked at that, and they figured about if everybody made the right decisions they are capable of, and there's costs involved, it's about 8% of the carbon reductions. The other 92% has to come from changing our production systems.
Right.
That's not to discourage people from making individual changes that they can. It's a good way to educate yourself on how the energy system works and the broader changes we need. But we can't say we can't change the government, so let's do it as consumers. We're not going to buy our way out of this crisis.
One book that I recently read, Paul Hawkins' Regeneration, and Paul Hawkins is the one who wrote Drawdown, very well respected in this field. But you read Regeneration, and it's just amazing how many, as you say, Howie, how many business models are based on unecological processes. Everything from big food to big agriculture to the big agrochemical companies. There is so much big money, and there's so much big corporations lined up against doing the things that are necessary to save the planet. There is so much work to be done. But the one thing that makes me hopeful is that even though you have these old line oligarchs who are trying to maintain the status quo for their profits, you've got a lot of people who want change. And we're almost to the point where we're going to get that change. If you look at the carbon pricing or the carbon pricing bill, the senators who were counting the heads for the Build Back Better said they had 49 votes in the Senate for carbon pricing. 49. We know who opposed it, Manchin. If it had passed in the Senate, it would have passed in the House. To be one vote away from a carbon pricing, effective carbon pricing bill is something I wouldn't have even dreamed of saying a year ago. So I think that we have an opportunity in the next election, if we can get the climate voters out, to get meaningful climate legislation passed under this administration. And if we don't get that done, then maybe you're right. Maybe you're right. At some place and at some point down the line, 10 years from now, we'll be in such an emergency that we'll need some kind of World War II mobilization, to get this thing back to where it should be. But I tell you, the American people are not here now. They are not willing to accept a dictatorship, a virtual dictatorship by the federal government to mobilize the US economy to focus on climate change. It is not something that is going to happen this year.
To be clear, I'm not calling for a dictatorship. Democratic public ownership and planning, democracy, economic democracy.
I think General King, I know you do a lot of work with the United Nations and such, and we're talking a lot about the U.S. How's the rest of the world doing on this? I mean, how does U.S. compare to what's happening in other nations and, you know, kind of the global policies? Chris?
We pretty much stink. If you want to get honest about it. A little history. I was stationed in the US Army in Europe in 1980. There was a significant Green Party with voting power in Germany in 1980. And all of the European countries have those kinds of power. The big problem to me is it's really that it's the United States, it's China, it's India, and it's Europe. Europe is doing very well. The other three of us that are the major sources of the carbon that's going into the atmosphere right now are not getting anywhere close to what we need to, according to the 6th IPCC report. It's not, we're not even slowing it down very much. And the amount of time that's left to be able to respond before we go over the tipping point, nobody knows exactly what that is. But, I mean, we have better calculations than we've ever had of where the carbon comes from, where it goes in sequestering, where it goes into the biological systems, where it goes in the chemical system, and how much is attributed to and partitioned well. And looking at the best data we have, which is better than we've ever known about our environment, we don't have very many years left before we go over that tipping point. The tipping point is, remember, this is driven because what we put in the air now, particularly as CO2, is going to last up to 100 years in the environment. So even if we flatlined right now, everybody and nobody grows any, that's still too much. So the rest of the world is not helping because they can't overcome the 4 big powers. And if you look at places in the developing world, their point is we're trying to eat, we're trying to stay warm, we're trying to meet what I say in environmental security as the basic human needs for survival. And their only energy sources are carbon driven. So it's not only that we have to do changes here, but there's a lot of support the major economic powers in the world are going to have to provide to the rest of the world, where the growing populations are, to be able to achieve what the world needs. We can do everything we want in the United States and we lose if we don't lead the rest of the world into a successful program that lowers the world carbon levels in a significantly shorter period of time than we had when we did Paris. We've done Paris and we've grown the carbon in the atmosphere by a significant amount since Paris. That's a world issue. And we're seeing the prices we're paying from that, just as the IPCC predicted, with the extreme weather that we're seeing, the increase in sea level rise. One of the scariest things I found in the IPCC report from the science standpoint, the largest rate of change in the bad outcomes, particularly, I'm talking this time about sea level rise, is sea level rise in the last 10 years was 3 times what it was 20 years ago. Sea level rise is accelerating faster than even the loss of the ice caps, which was the worst condition we had when the IPCC 5 came out. The loss of ice cover and the loss of glaciers. And how that affects the hydrosphere. So to answer your question, we stink. Other places like China are worse. India, very significant concerns because they got 4 times our population. But per capita, as somebody pointed out, we're the worst in the world. We not only have to do what we need to do in this United States, which each of you all have been talking about, but we have to become a world leader that gets a good plan in place and works to execute it by not only supporting inside the United States, but supporting a world order of change. Europe's ready to go along. China's a very tough one to understand. They probably look and deal with the science better than any other government, but they have to make their own decisions about what they can afford, and they have a different view of human values than we do, that we have trouble dealing with and recognizing. So we've got a much larger problem than even just what the United States is dealing with. And I think a lot of that's been caused because of 15 years of the United States not leading at all, actually being very regressive in helping with any of the world order type issues that have to be dealt with. So we like to talk about the United States, but you better look worldwide and figure out what's going on around us, because like I said, we could lower our contributions to climate change, to CO2, to greenhouse gases dramatically. And if we're not leading in the rest of the world, we're all still going to lose.
You know, Robin asked that question earlier about what do we do as individuals to lower our consumption. And Chris, you touched on this. I mean, India and China produce massively more carbon than we do, greenhouse gas emissions. But when you divide that by population, the average American produces 16 times more carbon than any individual Chinese or Indian citizen.
Yes.
So, you know, it's really in our laps. I mean, if we can fix our problem here, the world is going to follow. New technology, reduction, you know, all those things that are very simple to do. If we've got the ambition and the stamina to make those changes, I think the world will follow.
There are some technologies that are available now that if we would take off and implement those, from an economic standpoint, it makes sense kind of standpoint, we could start the momentum. It's like Steve was talking about. You got to take the first steps. You got to get the small steps. We need to. I've always proposed that the first good step we can make in the United States is to get rid of coal immediately. I don't know if anybody probably noticed, because we can. Most of the coal, 92% of it's going to go to electricity. And we have substitutes for that can be implemented very quickly. You probably didn't notice it, but I followed this because I've been a coal hater since I did my first coal-fired power plant study, which was like 1980. The EPA is going back to try to implement the controls on coal ash piles. The waste that comes off when you burn coal, they're sitting in ash piles all over the country. When they break, it's an environmental disaster and hundreds of people die. We had that in Tennessee when TVA lost one of their coal-fired ash plants that got flooded out, and it all went into a river and hundreds of people died. Not immediately, a few immediately, but 10 years later from acute cancer exposure to all the toxic metals and stuff that are in those. Those are all over the country. But we don't make coal pay for cleaning those up. That's why they keep doing that kind of stuff. If you want to put a tax on something, put a tax on coal ash, because it's a hazardous waste. As hazardous as anything that we have spent time and money on across the country with our Superfund work. And get rid of that, substitute it in, and at least take care of that. It's also the best thing from an electric power system, because there's more energy wasted in coal production and use than anything else we do. You get about 10% of the energy out of a pound of coal by the time you get it to the place it's going to be used, because capturing that at the power plant is a low energy thing, and then transmission is low energy. It's just almost a waste of energy to even produce the stuff. We got to find the quick wins. Coal is my first and favorite to get rid of, so we don't have another 100 million tons of coal ash laying around waiting to escape into the environment. I am more positive about the U.S. economic and technology system being able to be a strong contributor than I've heard anybody else talk about. I think they have slowly and quietly developed a better understanding of how to build and implement good clean energy systems.
Chris, could I interrupt to ask you a question?
Sure you can.
I think you're uniquely qualified to throw some light on this. You've mentioned how us getting this done won't be enough. It's got to be global. As both an environmental scientist and as a military person with military background, this is a challenge for humanity like we've never faced before. If we can't learn to cooperate and coordinate our efforts, we're doomed.
Absolutely, I agree.
And what is involved militarily and politically to do that on a global basis? What has to happen for us to stop competing with each other before we compete ourselves to death?
Well, the big problem there is that military serve at the pleasure and under the command of our civilian political authority. Now, all right, I said that. Now, is there more?
If the American people could get the government to change, how should that change? How should our government employ the military?
It has always worked. What I have done a lot in my military career was doing humanitarian response, where there was a disaster, natural or man-made, where we take if you have a disaster and you have 50,000 refugees. I worked on one, we had 1 million refugees we were trying to take care of. It was in Goma, Zaire from the Rwanda genocide. We had 1 million people, and we took the American military to the middle of Africa to provide logistics, medical supply support. We did not treat indigenous people, but we provided the ability of Doctors Without Borders and other wonderful organizations to provide first line medical care, provide food. The biggest thing we had to provide was clean water, because the thing that was killing them most was cholera in the water they were drinking. The militaries are going to have to prepare for those kinds of activities, because even based on the carbon that is already in there, we're going to be dealing with extreme disasters. We're going to be dealing with large scale environmental refugees from places like Bangladesh, all over the world, where sea level is going to make a difference, where an increase in tornadoes and hurricanes are going to displace people. That gives us an opportunity to develop levels of cooperation between militaries, not worrying about fighting each other, but worrying about how we can cooperate to protect others, to respond to others, because these disasters won't isolate. They will have large scale effects. We've already seen that with epidemic disease. You can't keep it out. If epidemic disease builds in one place, it's going to spread throughout the world.
How can we use our military to head off some of these disasters rather than just respond to them? How can our government, militarily or otherwise, what can our government do to head off these disasters?
To me, the military is in support of the primary mission in climate change. We are not the leader in that. We are not set up to do that, but we have a significant mission in that support. Sometimes it can be preventative. It's certainly to be the 911 answering service when major disasters start somewhere in the world and we have to respond. Because we're the only people who can move major logistics, move to help people, build refugee camps in rapid order, can help and set up types of things like that. But we are never going to be the leader and the one that takes charge. That's not the way our government works. We cannot have a military that becomes the decision makers in that.
I agree. I think we're the military, and I know we've talked about this report before, you and I, the 2003, 2004 an abrupt climate change scenario and its implications for United States national security.
Yes.
We're talking about the human race, an existential threat. In other words, the human race may go extinct. That report predicted, I think very accurately, all of the stuff we've talked about, sea level rise, wildfires, hurricanes, whatever. The real killer is going to be when we can't grow enough food to feed everybody and millions, if not billions of people are starving to death. I can't remember who the quote is from, but there's a quote about how people with guns don't tend to die quietly when they're dying of hunger.
Yes.
Right now, it's mostly starving children in Africa and third world countries. What happens when you have to have guns to protect your food supply in the heart of the United States?
That is one of the worst case scenarios that we look at. But the truism is that environmental security is built around the concept that people cannot provide for their basic human needs in the way that they want to, in the place they've always lived, that are driven by cultures. So what are their choices? And that's where you get down to two: fight or flight.
Right.
And both of those things are what the military has to consider when we look at a strategic analysis of what are the threats to U.S. national security. What I have been trying to do for the last 20 years is explain to the military, one of the things you have to consider is the environmental security implications of water as a scarce resource, climate change, and those other major changes in the environment that allow disease to spread more readily, that produce these existential threats, and are just as important as somebody that's got a whole lot of guns someplace else.
You mentioned water, and that 2003 report mentions the river that flows between China and India.
Yeah, there's seven.
Both nuclear armed nations.
No, and Pakistan. You left one out.
Right.
Pakistan, when I teach this, I talk about the Tibetan Plateau, the impact climate change is having on that watershed, which is driven by this ice and snow cover being the water source. That's 3.2 billion people in that one watershed. And 7 of the 15 largest armies, 3 of which are nuclear armed: Pakistan, India, and China. And I ask my students, is that a national security consideration for the United States of America? It absolutely better be.
Hasn't it been a concern of the military, but not the political establishment for a few decades now?
The military has been looking.
Been more concerned than the political system.
But remember how this works. The military responds to the national security strategy, which is published by the President of the United States. Then we get together and we write our individual Army, Navy, Department of Defense national security strategies for the military. But it has to respond to the presidential national security strategy. One of our biggest problems is that changes every 4 years. For 8 years in a row, we had strong comments about national security and climate change in the national security strategy. And the military responded by building it into their own strategies. And we had a Department of Defense strategy for climate change that was published in early 2014. That went away in 2020. So we were back to square one. That's one of our big challenges in the military, is this yo-yoing back and forth about what you can do, because what we have here in climate change by the science is a 100-year war. What we put in the environment lasts 100 years. So we have a 100-year war. Well, first of all, from military history, we never do well at 100-year wars. Ask the people in Europe, it just doesn't do well. We don't do well at long wars. We don't do well at making strategies that we have to sustain for a long time.
That 2003 report predicted that if we do have a collapse of food and water, that mankind, the civilization will collapse. It won't just be failed states here or there. Civilization will collapse, and we'll be back to a Hobbesian state of nature, a war of all against all for mere survival.
That's, like I said, that's one of the worst case scenarios that you have. Steve, you weighed in a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know,
He's a
on the road
military
to
buddy, so.
extinction, you know, there's going to be all kinds of bad things happening. And, you know, the sea level rise, if it rises just a few feet, is going to collapse the financial system of the United States. I mean, all the banks that have lent all the money for all the mortgages for all these houses and businesses, you know, and hotels that are going bankrupt, you know, these loans will never be repaid. We live in a very fragile society from the point that it's very intricate, it's very interlaced, it's very interwoven, and that's the way we get the efficiencies which create the standard of living that we enjoy. And when those threads start to unravel, it's going to go south pretty quick. And, you know, as you said, Winston, you know, people don't starve, you know, go willingly if they've got guns, you know, or if they've got nuclear weapons, or if they have other alternatives. You know, we have to do everything we can in the next few years to keep the worst from happening further down the road. I would say, you know, it's a global problem. And one thing I would like to say is that carbon pricing, you know, going back to a solution, is something that transcends borders. If you have carbon pricing in the United States and border adjustment fees, they've got carbon pricing in Europe and border adjustment fees, then it forces everybody to start to price carbon globally and start to reduce their use of it. So, you know, rather than jump to military solutions, which I don't really think that there are, but, you know, there are economic solutions, there are financial solutions, which can get everybody to start to pull their weight and get this thing done. I mean, that is something that needs to happen, is that all the major economies of the world need to start putting on a price of carbon. Now, as we know, you know, we've mentioned the big four. There's China, there's the United States, there's India, and
Sure.
there's Europe. But that's about it. That accounts for about 80% of carbon emissions. And if we can all get together on an international carbon pricing scheme that works, we can drag the other 20% along. I mean, they will have no option but to join the big four in whatever we decide is going to be the global approach to reducing carbon emissions.
Karyn.
That's the fact.
We need
Karyn, what'd you say?
international treaties with mandatory requirements, not voluntary requirements. And again, I like the way you wrap that up, Stephen, because there's still hope. There's still time. Let's not get all carried away with the worst case scenario. Let's leave our listeners with hope. You know, start voting climate, start working with Citizen Climate Lobby and, you know, to pass a fee on carbon. Hopefully it'll be $50 or $100 a ton, and there'll be no exceptions.
It will get there. It will get there. It will get there in due time.
Stephen and Karyn, how soon do you think, best case scenario, we'll get some of this legislation enacted?
If you ask me, I think I already said I think we were one vote away. I think we were one vote away in the Senate from getting it enacted now.
Didn't you need reconciliation to get it with 50 votes? It was not part of Build Back Better, so you'd have to get 60 votes.
Well, it was White House, Senator Whitehouse said he had 49 votes for carbon pricing in the Senate. And if they got it in the Senate, they'd get it in the House, and Biden said he'd sign it. So we're that close. We're that close to meaningful legislation. And I think, you know, and I know there's a lot of gloom and doom about what's going to happen in the 2022 elections. They're 10 months away. We don't know how the fickle American public is going to vote 10 months from now. Nobody knows.
I'd like to talk about what could happen.
I believe that we can, I believe that we can get a Congress which would be able to find a few more votes to pass that kind of legislation.
I do too, absolutely. And, you know, if it's the thing is, in midterm elections, historically, the party that's out of power picks up a lot of votes, if not takes the majority. And, you know, in 2024, if Trump's not in jail or died of heart disease from his obesity, he's going to run again in all likelihood, and he could potentially win again. And then we're back to, so let's get it done now. Let's have some urgency about this. Let's make 2022 the year of the climate voter. Let's do it.
Right.
All right, Karyn,
I'd
here's
like
my
to address
question for you and all the panelists. If you had to take all the voters, all the citizens of the United States who are concerned about the climate and want the right thing done, and all the voters in the United States who would like us to be a genuine democracy where citizens would actually have an indirect vote, and through our representatives, the will of the people would actually be reflected in the legislation passed by Congress. Venn diagram, how much is the overlap there? How many people would like us to be both a democracy and do the right thing with regard to the climate? I think the overlap is almost 100%.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the overlap is 100%. I thought you meant what proportion of the total population would that be? No, I think the overlap is probably, yeah, there's probably a very one-to-one correlation with that.
I think it'd be 2/3 in each case who would want
Yeah,
both.
I was going to say 60-40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, there's another piece, and this is an appreciation that CCL has that maybe isn't shared by others. There's been a lot of primarying is the verb, but where Republicans who are concerned about climate, who want to get legislation passed, have been primaried out by the Trumpers, who have gotten rid of most all the Republicans who would vote for climate action legislation. We don't know in 2022 how much influence Trump is going to have. And we don't know how many of Republicans who are interested in climate action are going to, be elected into office. But a lot of Republicans are concerned. If you count the Republicans in the House and the Senate, there are majorities in both houses, between Democrats and Republicans for carbon pricing. There are Republicans who would vote for carbon pricing.
If there were two,
they wouldn't be primary.
If there were two Republicans in the US Senate right now who would vote to get rid of the filibuster and pass all the things we need to pass, then Manchin and Sinema would be robbed of their power.
But if it were normal process,
two Republicans.
If it were normal process, it would. But remember, we aren't under normal process. We're under reconciliation, and the Republicans aren't players in reconciliation.
Okay, one of the things that we do at our Vote Climate page is also an analysis of our voters guide. And one of the ways we break it down is by party. So, we know there's a partisan divide on the issue, but the partisan divide is much bigger than you might think. So for Senate incumbents, the mean Republican score is 14.7 out of 100, and the mean Democratic score is 91.8.
Mm-hmm.
But it gets better with challengers. Okay, so Senate challengers had 17.7 mean, and
wow.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not huge, but it gets an increment, just a little bit better. But
Right.
The partisan divide is obscene. House incumbents, the Republicans scored 12.1, the Democrats 90, and the House challengers 28 for the mean Republicans and 75 for the mean Democrats.
Right.
So the partisan divide is wider than you might even think.
And I think
But-
after all the purging, I think it has been. But remember, when McCain ran for president as a Republican, he was for carbon pricing. He ran on a platform of carbon pricing, right?
Yeah.
So it isn't as if these people don't exist in the Republican Party, or to some extent, but they're just quiet, they're silent. And as long as they are purged from running for office, they are going to toe the line.
Bob, I see your hand's been up for a while now. Would you
It
like
is.
to get in here?
I'd like to just squeeze in here a little bit because we are running down toward the end of this broadcast, and I'd like to address a few of the questions that are outstanding. I know I read an article just a couple of days ago talking about how the states are suddenly moving towards nuclear power as a way to get their carbon emissions down, which kind of blows my mind. And Ramona posted a question earlier noting that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently had a webinar, and it was focused on increasing nuclear energy. How do you guys feel about like that? I mean, we were talking about coal ash waste and how toxic that is. What happens when we transition all this to nuclear and we have all that nuclear waste to deal with? Anyone?
I'll take that on first, and I'll just throw it out there. I have a lot more fear of global warming caused by CO2 emissions than I do of nuclear power. That's it. There have been orders of magnitude more people killed by fossil fuel emissions and the byproducts of fossil fuels than have been killed by nuclear power. And that's a fact. I think that we should not shut down nuclear power plants in this country until we're carbon neutral. Let's leave them open there. They're an existing source of carbon-free electricity. Let's put them last in the line. Let's do the coal first, like Dr. King says, let's get rid of the coal places first. Let's get rid of the natural gas. And then when we've got everything in order that we can have only sustainable energy, then we can start to shut down the nuke plants. But the nuke plants that we have in existence now are not the ones they're thinking about building. The ones they're thinking about building are going to be 5th generation nuclear plants. They can't do a Chernobyl. They can't do a Fukushima. They can't do a 3 Mile Island. They cannot do that. And then ultimately, I think we're going to have to get to fusion energy. I think we're fairly close to getting fusion energy. There's been a lot that's been invested in the United States and in Europe and in other countries in fusion energy. And I think that ultimately we're going to have to get to fusion energy. Now, when you talk to the utilities, that's what they say. They say we can't rely solely on wind and solar. They're too variable. We need a stock of reliable energy, and that would be nuclear energy. And as long and until we can prove that we can do it just with renewable energy, I think nuclear is the best option we have.
Howie.
Yeah, we already got a fusion plant. It's called the sun. Powers the sun and the wind and the precipitation, the water. Nuclear power has been an uneconomical industry. It only continues to exist in states like New York and Ohio, where they bribe to get the subsidies, and a few other states with subsidies. Exelon wanted to shut down 4 nukes here in New York State, and Cuomo gave them $8 billion to stay open again in the name of carbon-free energy. So you got an economic problem. They had big tax breaks to build new nukes in South Carolina and Georgia. Because of cost overruns and construction delays, the nukes in South Carolina have been canceled. The 2 nukes at Vogel in Georgia are only still operating because Brian Kemp won that stolen election in Georgia, and he's a creature of Georgia Power and the Southern Company. And they are throwing billions down that rat hole. So it's not economical. You still have the problem of waste you have to keep segregated for hundreds of thousands of years. And as these plants get older, they get embrittled. And all the parts, because of the radiation, are problematic, which increases the likelihood of a serious accident. And, that is an extreme event. And they're way over their, original lifetime. It's supposed to last for 40 years. Now they've got license for up to 30 or 40 more years. They're really on the edge. And then this so-called next generation is old stuff. Thorium nukes, small modular reactors. They started that stuff back in the 40s. It didn't work, it failed. Small modular reactors don't have the same economies of scale, so they're even less economical. I mean, there's so many problems with nuclear power. With the money we would invest in nuclear power to keep the ones we got open or to build new ones, we could build a lot more megawatts of solar, wind, and the intermittency problem with a smart grid, transmission lines across the country, storage, green hydrogen. There's lots of ways to provide stability. And for that, I would suggest looking up some recent article by Amy Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute that I think appeared in the Yale 350 whatever environment journal. But no, nuclear power is a diversion. And I think it's a big problem with Build Back Better because Biden was the only presidential candidate that got contributions from the executives of the main nuclear lobby, the Nuclear Research Institute, I think it's called. So anyway, I'm for no nukes.
I basically agree with Howie fundamentally, although Vote Climate US PAC doesn't take a position on nuclear. I basically agree with Howie, but if we need nuclear to get off fossil fuels, the problem is, as Howie said, it takes a long time to build the plants. They cost way too much money. Then there's the waste, but I'm learning new things about the waste from some of my contacts that say that the waste is about a cup of waste per person or something like that. It's a very small amount of waste, which I didn't realize. But I guess if we need nuclear to get off fossil fuels, it's worth staying with it. I don't see the point of investing a lot more into nuclear unless it is fusion,
All I can say is look at Germany, Angela Merkel, bless her heart, the great Cold Warrior, she shut down the nuke plants and built the largest coal-fired plant in the world to replace it. And they still have not been able to replace that energy that they lost from those nuke plants. And they're dependent on Russian natural gas to make up, what the shortfall as well. So Germany put itself in a real hole by committing to shutting down those nuclear plants. And when you look at the nuke plants that have been shut down in the United States, the replacement has not been wind or solar, but coal, because the utilities need something that they can rely on and not something that's as variable as solar and wind. Now, I agree with you when the solar gets up and we get all of this nice new flexible grids in place, and when the green hydrogen comes in place, and when they solve all these problems with variability, when everybody has more insulation in their house, so we don't have as much demand. When all these things happen, then we can start to shut down nuke plants. But we aren't there yet.
I'm not a scientist, but I greatly respect the climate scientists on this. Myself and Chris King have yet to weigh in. And I'd just like to say, I don't know what Chris's opinion is on this, but I agree with him.
You're about to hear Chris's opinion. When people ask me what we do, what I say is all of the above. It is to do the transition. We're going to have a transition period where we retain some of the nuclear facilities we have, building a whole bunch more unless a new technology is proven out is probably not cost effective. But Karyn, it's 1 to 10 million in the volumes that you create between coal and nuclear. As far as what you have to store, it is very intense, highly radioactive material that we store, but it is so much better than the massive amounts of coal ash that are spewing out all over the country that will eventually require trillions of dollars to clean up if we're going to clean them up. We just cannot afford to do away with something. Nuclear is the highest regulated we have ever seen as far as the technology. Coal does whatever it wants. Nuclear is highly regulated based on the safety of the systems. Is it 100% safe? No, it's not. But the risk analysis that goes into where you put a nuclear plant, how it has to be built, that's the reason it's so costly. It's because of the safety measures that have been built into those systems. It's not a perfect system, and it's not something I want to retain for the rest of of human existence. But like Steve says, when I balance out what coal dumps out of its pipe every day in the form of, it dumps more uranium than goes into nuclear plants. Uranium is a component of many of the raw coal that we burn in the United States. It's a very small amount, but when you burn millions and millions of tons of it, you're releasing a lot of uranium as part, or putting it into an ash pile. So when I do a health risk analysis of the two, I will still fall for retaining and sustaining high levels of standards on those nuclear plants until they can be replaced. Nuclear is 9% of the total energy system that we use in the United States right now. It has been 9% for the past 20 years. Coal has dropped to being a little less than nuclear right now. But replacing, like Germany did, replacing nuke plants with coal is absolutely the wrong idea.
Absolutely right.
That's my opinion.
We can make the transition off of fossil fuels without nuclear. We should, but it doesn't sound like we're likely to be able to do that. I hope we can.
I do too.
Winston, do you want to tell us about your book? Can you tell us about your book?
Let's
I
not do
can.
that yet. Let's finish these questions first.
Oh.
We got another question from Robert. It's what about the power of consumer boycotts? And I think that came in when we were talking about actions we can take, to move politically forward towards renewables and other things. So what about the power of consumer boycotts? Howie, you want to start that?
Well, if you need a car to get to work, to school, to shop, because you live in a metro area that's been designed for sprawl and there's no mass transit, you can't get rid of your car. That's what I mean, individual choices, and not everybody can afford to, swap out a gas heating for a heat pump unless somebody's financing the upfront cost. So there's not really that much power individuals have over the whole system. And not everybody can afford to boycott, using their car to get to work and just, making a living. So that's, why I come back to that International Energy Agency study, which looked at this. Individual choices for those who can make them would reduce carbon emissions by 8%. The other 92%'s got to come.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with getting?
There's nothing wrong with that, but the idea that we do that instead, because the question was originally posed in the context, we can't get the government to do stuff. Let's do it individually. And I'm saying, we can't, like I said, we can't shop our way out of this crisis.
I would say the power of consumer boycotts is infinitesimal compared with the power of proxies. If every citizen in the United States, this is, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Doesn't say how the consent of the governed is obtained. In a book that was published anonymously in 1689, because John Locke feared for his safety and his life if he published it openly, John Locke became the first political philosopher to openly champion democracy as the only lawful basis for government, the consent of the people as the only lawful basis for government. And he laid out 3 conditions that had to be met for what he called a perfect democracy. And Karyn, this is from my book, by the way. Perfect democracy, everyone has an equal vote or equal representation. You have majority rule, period. No single president or 5 Supreme Court justices or 39, 40 Republicans in Congress can overrule the majority. And last but not least, and this is something missing from our system, never been in it, the supremacy of the legislative branch. You don't have a presidential veto. You don't have a Supreme Court that can nullify legislation that's been passed. And if we get those 3 things in place, all of a sudden, what the people care about will matter. The people of America care about the climate crisis.
Yes, they do.
2/3 of the American people know it's either existential or serious, or at least something we should be doing something about.
So let me ask you a question. If we had a new constitutional convention in 2022,
Yes.
are we likely to get what you're asking for, or likely to get something far worse?
If the convention met today, we'd get something far worse. If the
Then why
convention,
can't we talk about something constructive that we can do today?
well, I think what we can do today is encourage our representatives to do two things: put proxies in place in as many states as possible and in the US House of Representatives, and then pass a bill that enables us to amend the Constitution so we can extend that to the Senate. And then we get climate legislation, we get background checks for guns, we get a federal job guarantee, we get a public option for healthcare, we get a whole lot of people who are more successful in their pursuit of happiness and a lot less likely to storm the Capitol or kidnap the governor of Michigan or get in a fist fight with someone on a plane about masks. These are unhappy people. There are a lot of deeply unhappy people in this country. And part of the reason is our government is doing a piss poor job of protecting our lives, our liberty, and assisting us in the pursuit of happiness. Howie had an agenda earlier that he mentioned that is basically Franklin Roosevelt's economic Bill of Rights. Job guarantee, healthcare, lifelong education, on and on and on. If we have a genuine democracy, we get everything. If we don't, we're going to go right on with the broken, dysfunctional system that we've got right now, where we argue, discuss, and debate endlessly, and meaningful action rarely, if ever, happens. It doesn't take a majority to get something done in the United States. It takes a mass movement of millions of people pushing for decades to finally get women the right to vote, child labor laws, a minimum wage, whatever. If we move to democracy and proxies, if a legislature anywhere in the country passed that legislation right now, the system could be in place by January of next year.
We're out of time.
Okay.
Let's move into closing statements. And Winston, I feel like you're already making your closing statement.
Okay.
So go ahead and add to it, and let's wrap it up and share where people can learn more about your book, website, whatever you want.
Well, governmentbythepeople.org is essentially one of the main chapter of my book. It's been adapted for website, the website format. It is a chapter I'm still fine tuning, so the website changes a little bit. As recently as a week ago, I realized that elections would be optional if we had a proxy system in place. And that opened up a whole new vista. Howie, you talked about, you hadn't thought deeply about the implications. You're not alone. There's one member of Congress, only one that I've talked to directly about this so far, and I'll protect his identity for now, I guess. But he was very interested. I'll give this away maybe to the panelists if nobody else. He's the guy who introduced the Fair Representation Act. So he's a big fan of ranked choice voting. When I told him about using ranked choice voting to have weighted votes, he was excited. When I realized we could do it better with proxies, he was even more excited. And I'm getting ready to get back in touch with him in the next day or two. I can only tell you, this has been a life-altering experience for me to realize that this simple reform would be so powerful, change so many things, fundamentally alter the nature of our government to make it a genuine democracy, where what the people want would matter. And the people want action on the climate. They want a lot of other things too, but they want action on the climate. They want all the things we've talked about tonight to happen. And so I'll close with a very brief quote from Benjamin Franklin: "Well done is better than well said." I've enjoyed our conversation tonight immensely. I always enjoy visiting with this group of people. And I thank you, Bob, for putting this together. but well done is better than well said. Let's do something.
Stephen, closing comments.
Yeah, well, I think I've had enough time to talk. I'd just like to say one thing is I don't want to change the subject of the conversation, that I think the majority of the American people want to do something about climate change. That majority grows all the time. I think we can use the current political process to force that change without entering into a lot of other discussions that I believe will just confuse the matter. This is where I sort of disagree with Winston and Howie. I think it is an emergency. We only have a very small window of opportunity to act. My window of opportunity that I'm looking at is just the Biden administration. But if we can't get this thing solved during the Biden administration or shortly thereafter, we are into, I guess, Howie's dream of a World War II kind of mobilization, where it's going to take emergency powers to make up all the time that we've lost.
Karyn, closing comments.
Vote Climate US PAC and I are looking toward a future of hope. Let's not lose hope. This can be a very dispiriting conversation if you lose hope. And the things that we need our candidates to support are 100% renewables by 2030, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, which can mean a lot of things, but fundamentally supporting an end to fossil fuel subsidies, supporting ending fossil fuel extraction on public lands. We want our candidates to support zero human-made greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, because we know, and the general said this earlier, it's going to take 100 years from the time we get to zero emissions to start to bring down the atmospheric greenhouse gases, which are already 420 parts per million instead of the upper safe limit of 350. So zero human-made greenhouse gases by 2050. And also we believe that we're going to have to start to support some sort of carbon dioxide removal, which to us means carbon farming and sustainable agriculture, reforestation and afforestation, wetland construction, and direct air capture of carbon dioxide with recycling. It does not mean carbon capture and sequestration, because we believe that that is a method that would perpetuate the fossil fuel economy. And that's the last thing that we want to do. The American people must demand political action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the form of a federal fee on carbon and zero emissions by 2050. We support US House and Senate candidates that back our mission, and we oppose those who don't. Take action today. The singular most important thing that you can do as an individual is to vote climate. Go to our website, follow our voters guides. We should soon have every state and every federal office graded on our website with a climate calculation. Use it to pick your next everybody. That's it. Thank you very much.
Chris, closing comments. You're muted, Chris.
Here we go. All right, I just want to thank everybody for the participation. I don't have the strong opinions about changing the government because I have served the government so long, and I will leave that to the experts like Winston and Howie. But I tend to go like Steve does. Let's do everything we can within the structure that's here now and work towards those changes that would be a better democracy at the same time. But we can't wait around for those changes because I don't think they're going to happen very fast. And the time is running out, like Karyn was talking about. Again, my solution is all of the above, and those changes that put less carbon greenhouse gases into the atmosphere on a daily basis. my favorite is to get rid of coal as quickly as we can because it's evil in so many different ways besides just the greenhouse gases that it produces in there. The American people, I think, understand better than they have in a long time that this is a critical nature. The people that I see, even ones that I would say politically, I wouldn't expect that from, are more and more being able to recognize. And I think the power of the American people to respond on an individual basis and to then drive businesses to be more proactive, more into what are the right things to do from the long term. I still believe in that. That's the part of democracy I believe in, is the power of people to act in a responsible place. Unfortunately, they're looking for that critical moment, and we can't wait because the critical moment would be past us and we won't even know it in this particular kind of problem. So I applaud everybody who is here that's working so hard to try to make a change, and I'll continue to try to do what I do, as far as trying to bring the science down to a level that people can understand the true nature of the problem, because I think it can be described simply and cleanly so that people will be able to recognize that it's time for them to participate as well as everybody else. So thank you for this opportunity, Bob. I appreciate it.
Howie, closing comments.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and everybody. I always enjoy talking to this group, and I just clean up with a few points that I wanted to make as we went along. As far as, and I'm not sure I heard Karyn right, but James Hansen wants to get back to 350 parts per million by the end of the century. And his nutshell paper, which is the last major paper I've seen him do, lays out that scenario. But it's really optimizing the amount of natural carbon sequestration we do by afforestation, rebuilding soils, restoring carbon-rich wetlands or carbon-rich habitats like wetlands and mangroves. So I think we got to do that. We mentioned the tipping points. We don't know when they are. And once they start cascading those positive feedback loops, we may be in a runaway situation. So I'm just for pushing the timeline. And Winston, I know who your anonymous member of Congress is. And tell him when you meet him, I'm a fan of his bill. And as far as getting progressives like the squad, it's on my to-do list to badger them, particularly those in New York.
I sent a letter to Cory Bush. Sent a letter to Cory Bush today.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go after AOC and Jabal Bowman and who's the other guy? Montclair, somebody. So another point is, look, I'm anti-nuke, I'm anti-fossil fuels too, but I also recognize that you just can't turn them off or we're all gonna freeze. It's about zero here right now. I don't want that. But instead of replacing them with coal like they did in Germany or gas like they're doing in New York, solar, wind, water, smart grid, we got that technology. We know what to do. That's what we need to put the money into. And I just don't want to throw cold water on Stephen's optimism about the climate, the carbon tax, but look, it was never in Build Back Better, which was the reconciliation bill. If it's got 49 votes in the Senate, it's still going to need 60 if it's not part of the Build Back Better to break filibuster. So I'm just saying we're not there yet, and it's not that close. Just to sort of say where we're really at. Another point, it was suggested, and this has been the conventional wisdom, that if the United States and a few other big countries reduce their carbon, it'll have a really big impact on the world, and it will. But the reality is, and because we've exported a lot of our manufacturing, more and more of this carbon is being generated in China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and they're becoming the main source of generation, even if we, through ownership of global corporations, may be responsible. And also, we're the ones importing a lot of these products. So that's why it's got to be global, including these countries, which is Winston was pointing, Chris was pointing out, it's really going to be difficult to bring along China and India and some of these other countries. But that's where the carbon tax, which is a tariff at the border, creates incentives for those countries to lower their carbon so they can import to us. So I think we agree there. And then last point is, I talk about deep cuts in military spending, but, listening to Chris, and this is what I've always believed, it's not the dollars so much as the human resources. People like Chris, who's an engineer, people that push papers, administer things. We need to redirect that from war to climate action, humanitarian purposes, and that can be through the existing military. Let's be the world's humanitarian superpower instead of the one always going off to war. So I think, that, and the other thing, I'm a former Marine, and I'll tell you, the job training, when you move up the ranks or take a new job, is better than I ever saw in my career in construction or, logistics. So that's an organization that we can repurpose for these purposes. So I just wanted to affirm that. And finally, people want to know what I'm about and what I'm doing. HowieHawkins.us. It's where you can find out more about the Green New Deal, Eco-Socialist Green New Deal program. And like you'll see on there, a little polemic I got in Counterpunch this morning titled Bipartisan Biden Builds Back Bupkis, Reflections on his first year since his inauguration. So it's at HowieHawkins.us.
Thank you. And I want to thank our live audience. We appreciate your time and your questions. And I want to thank the Climate Council for making this conversation possible. You can learn more about the Climate Council at climategkc.org. That's climategkc.org. They provide a climate news feed, a podcast, workshops, and other great opportunities like this. And this climate conversation will be posted on YouTube. So you can search YouTube for Climate GKC or just subscribe to the Climate GKC channel and you'll get an email when this video drops. Thank you for being part of the conversation.